Hello and welcome to another episode of Just Onside. It's going to be a slightly unusual episode, this one. We're recording the day after. Uh, is it the day after OS? Was it yesterday or the day before?
Yes.
The Brussels shooting. So it's been a strange week and a half. Most of you who are watching this will be aware there's a lot of things happening in the world. Uh, most of it not sport related. And we just thought really that what we wanted to do is just have a little conversation, have a little chat, maybe have a little bit of sporting conversation, but also just have a general chat with what's happening and what our thoughts are. So before we do that, OS, how are you?
I'm doing good, Ayub. Just on that, you're right. There is a lot of, I guess, your heart drifts a lot during times when there's unrest in a world, especially a part of the world which is, I guess, near and dear to many, let's say. So I think to your point, it felt, not saying insensitive to talk about sport, but sport feels let's just say, not as important at times when there's a lot of violence and aggression and what have you, not least the events that we saw yesterday, shockingly, in Brussels. So you're right, you're absolutely right. I think you covered it well. It's just more a conversation between two friends, really, about what's happened, and it gives us an opportunity to discuss it. So that's kind of where we're at. But I'm doing well, thank you.
Right, and same with me. I mean, I'm doing okay. It's been quite a traumatic week, and that's primarily because I do have an interest in world politics and what happens in the world, and I do tend to get affected by injustices, or at least what I see as injustice. So it's been a sort of strange week, and obviously there's been topics of conversation around a certain issue which is happening in the Middle East. But really, what we wanted to just do is maybe just have a chat, and really what I want to do first, OS, is I mean we'll obviously get on to current events, but what I want to sort of talk about is sports and politics. I mean, there's been some who always say that sports and politics should never mix. Others subscribe to the alternative school of thought, which is that sports and politics are inextricably, what is the word? Inextricably linked.
Inextricable.
Yes. Uh, and it's difficult to divorce the two. What's your take on that? I mean, certainly from history, sport has always been involved, or politics has always been involved. I mean, I'll start off with this. I mean, I'm not sure whether you're a sporting historian in terms of athletics, but there's a famous athlete, American athlete, Jesse Owens,
Indeed.
uh, 19,
1936. Yeah.
yeah, the Berlin Games, and it was. I mean, there's he won the 100 meters, I think, in the 200 meters. He won the long jump.
Four
I
goals.
think, yeah, 4 goals. So
Four
he
gold
was obviously a
medals.
supreme athlete. And there was a question asked once when he got back to America. Apparently, Adolf Hitler, who was at the venue, looking at the success of Jesse Owens, walked out the stadium. Well, at least that's the story. And an American journalist asked him when he was back in America that I believe that Adolf Hitler never shook your hand after you won all those gold medals. And I think whether this is true or not, but certainly it was something that was quoted. Jesse Owens said, "Neither did the president of America." So it was a stance or a position that Jesse Owens took, which obviously reflected that there was inequalities in the world and in America as well. So what's your take on that in terms of sport and politics? Should it mix, or should we completely detach the two and let sports get on with sports and let politics get on with politics?
Uh, it's an interesting one, which I will answer in a. I'll give you my answer at the end as to what my personal feelings are. You're right, though. I mean, sport and politics has always had some kind of overlap, or at least when it comes to certain incidents, and through various ways, right? Sometimes it's symbolic, whether or not the particular sportsman or participants, as you mentioned about Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics, um, whether they, in terms of whether the moment represents something far larger, or whether or not it's a reaction to a perceived injustice or what have you. I will go through a few incidents. So you have some more famous than others in terms of some of the history. Famously in the NFL, you'll remember the incidents, I believe, in 2014 in Ferguson, Ayub, when a young gentleman was shot dead. I think Michael Brown, a young 18-year-old black man, was shot dead by a policeman. Some of the St. Louis Rams players, about 5 of them, raised their hands in kind of support and in protest to that. So they had their hands up gesture. I think you might remember, kind of a hands up, don't shoot. I think it was famously coined. Probably one of the more famous ones, perhaps going back in time, is probably the Muhammad Ali one. With the famous phrase coined, "I ain't got no quarrel with those Viet Cong," with regards to his refusal to fight in the Vietnam War in '67. You'll remember, famously, that led to the Cleveland Summit, which was attended to by 11 athletes and 1 politician, the famous ones being Kareem Abdul-Jabbar from basketball, Bill Russell also from basketball, Jim Brown from American football, and Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Jim Brown, and there's one other that'll come to me. So yeah, that was probably the more famous one, I would say, in terms of, kind of sporting figures using their influence, let's say, to protest at what they believe was the injustice. Because obviously, if you remember, Ali was, I think, sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined $10,000, banned for boxing during his prime for 3 years. So there's many others, and again, just very quickly going through them. You had the 1972 Olympics, the terrorism in Munich. Again,
rather poignant considering what's happening in the Middle East at the moment.
Indeed, Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, becoming the first black baseball player when he in 1947 playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. So there's been moments and various, like I said, in various different contexts, right? Many would argue has been to the benefit of let's say, kind of progress and change. Billie Jean King, in terms of in tennis, fighting for, in terms of women's rights and increasing and improving women's prize money, and it was because of her advocacy and her efforts, many argue, is that why women started to get, say, parity when it came to prize money. You're right, Jesse Owens is the famous one, the ideological claims of Adolf Hitler in terms of this kind of racial pureness and the supremacy of the Aryans and what have you. It's the one I remember reading a book about it when I was very, very young. It was probably one of the few books that I read in terms of about Jesse Owens's efforts in the Olympics. And again, it stands the test of time, doesn't it? You had the other one with Joe Louis, similar, defeating the master race. With the boxing, if you remember, he beat Max Schmeling, who was, again, portrayed the German Max Schmeling, who'd beaten him when Joe Louis was undefeated. And then there was this big, obviously, rematch in 1938. Again, stands the test of time. Joe Louis beat him with a first-round knockout. Obviously, Adolf Hitler at the time was promoting this kind of racial superiority of the Aryans, so portrayed Schmeling as that type of example. So there's many, many incidents. I'd say probably more recently, the Colin Kaepernick situation in American football. Talking about how he didn't kind of, and I don't want to misquote it, but essentially of his reasons for kneeling during the national anthem was that he didn't feel as much pride in a flag that represented police brutality and oppression towards minorities and black people. And again, I hope I've got that correct. But in any event, what I'm arguing is that this has always existed in some way, shape, or form. Now, the question you asked me was, should they mix as well? And I would argue that they should, especially when it's to affect positive change, to encourage good discussion, good debate. And that's the key. Often sportsmen and athletes are not always the best vehicle to have those conversations, because they are flawed just like the rest of us. And there are times and occasions when they represent something more than what they are just simply as a sportsman, in terms of, again, encouraging discussion and debate. And I'll finish with this before I get your initial thoughts. Again, my general conclusion is I'm comfortable, because ultimately sport and politics essentially yield the same thing, which is influence. Whether you are a political party looking to kind of garner support for your policies with regards to trying to get into power, and then govern said country or society or what have you, similar sportsmen are often, uh, in terms of popularity, uh, uh, even more so in this country, are more popular, obviously, than politicians and what have you, and they often used and propped up in many ways for advocating politicians or advocating policy and put at the forefront in terms of supporting certain agendas and narratives and what have you. So when it's for something positive or something that, let's say, the establishment or what have you wants to push, sportsmen are often propped up, right? And
Mm.
therefore, for me, it's a case of I'm comfortable with it, but I think I'm most comfortable when it's sportsmen that are encouraging good discussion. It's not necessarily a case of trying to ram home or ram it down your throat in terms of one particular narrative more than the other. It's just, I think, any time when you can encourage, and we'll come on to this perhaps later on, I think any time when you can encourage, and we'll go into the details of the Brussels incident as well. I think, again, just to finish off, anytime you can encourage good, honest, constructive conversation where you can agree to disagree,
Mm.
but you look at the totality of the information, and I think that's critical here in terms of the events of the last few weeks, in terms of having a voice and having said voice heard and how that voice is received. I think that I'm all for that. I think when it's often virtue signaling and what have you, when it comes to footballers, you've seen the recent furore with Jordan Henderson's move to Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia. I think therein I have perhaps less sympathy, but also less patience because I understand the transaction for what it's worth in the first place. So that's my first kind of opening salvo. What are your thoughts in terms of politics and sport? Do you see it as something that's beneficial, or do you see it as often being a hindrance?
Depending on who's using it, I think if the sportsman is using it or the sportswoman is using it, I have no issue. I think sporting personalities or sporting people should be allowed to express their opinions. I mean, my uh, personal beliefs are, I mean, if I had to put a label on myself, I'd call myself a socialist. I believe in social justice. I believe in equality and fairness. And that is at the very core of what I'm all about. Uh, and if you allow sportsmen to express their opinions, I mean, it could be opposite to that, and fair enough, so be it. I have no issues. I think my issue is when states become involved, and the reason why I say that is that it it, I talk about. I think it was the 1980 Olympic Games in Russia. It was held in Russia, and I think Russia had just invaded Afghanistan. So America decided to pull, not just America, I think there was a number of nations that pull their teams. Now, that's what I object to. I think that's when politics and sports, to me, it should be the individual decision of the the athletes, the sports people, and they should make the decision whether it's right, whether it's wrong. But it's you've got to be, I think, the way that the world is now, you've got to be have a certain amount of intellect, certain amount of uh, uh, sort of, you must be sort of reasonably well read to be able to offer opinions. This is where I think the problem is. And we'll talk about the crisis now in the Middle East. Uh, it's some have come out and expressed their colours. I mean, I think Sinchenko, he I think whether he tweeted, I think he did tweet or put on Instagram, I stand with Israel. I think some players have uh, posted Free Palestine, and I think players should be entitled, whether you agree or you disagree, they should be entitled to to express their opinion. But I think what I would want is maybe, I suppose, uh, because sportsmen are powerful, whether they like it or not. They reach out to a lot more people than perhaps even politicians. And from a personal point of view, obviously, I believe in social justice. I believe in equality. And 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 you, it cannot be something that to me is so fundamentally obvious that really I would like players who perhaps share that ideology to come out and speak out, to actually uh, uh, to put their head above the parapet. And I'll talk about the conflict that's happening in the Middle East. Now, they always say there's two. two sides to each argument. I mean, I must confess, to me, there is no two sides to the argument. I think it's quite straightforward. And as I said, I'm not I'm not going to be bashful about expressing my opinion. I think under international law, what Israel are doing in the Gaza is illegal. They've been an occupying force for a long time. I think what the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine are going through is unbelievable. I think, and again, it's nothing to do with religion. I think this is where sometimes people are very quick to perhaps just side with the religious angle. For me, it's absolutely in a sense, it's never been to do with religion. It's to do with justice and injustice. Now, to me, if it was flipped around where Palestinians were committing atrocities, it was the other way around where Palestine was Israel, Israel was Palestine, I'd be on the side of the oppressed. So in this case, I would be in the side of the Israelis. So to me, it's simple, and this is where maybe this is what I want sportsmen to perhaps be vocal. But again, it's based on having a certain amount of intellect, certain amount of understanding. We are living in an age where there's a lot of pressure to follow a certain narrative. Those who don't follow the narrative are vilified. In many cases, perhaps ostracized as well. So I've not seen enough of that. I think, unfortunately, too many are influenced by a powerful media and powerful politicians to tour a certain narrative.
Yeah, and I think just on that, and I want to ask you a question about tennis in a moment as well. So just hold that thought. But just on your point, I think the thing about what this current events in the world over the last 2 weeks, what they've brought about for me is a zest and a kind of search for more information. If you remember when we first started this podcast, I spoke to you about what I like to do in terms of when we're discussing a topic, in terms of how I like to research certain things and certain information. And ultimately, rather than being, let's say, clickbaity or what have you, the idea is that the information and the data will allow you to form an informed opinion. And I think what this conflict is about ultimately, at least for me, or what it's meant for me, has been, even the events of yesterday, which I'll come on to, has been trying to understand what's happening, why did it happen, trying to kind of understand the specifics of it, trying to appreciate the feelings of not just the Belgium fans, but obviously the Sweden fans, inside the building, inside the stadium, who were then, I think, released, I think, in the absolute early hours for their own safety, what that would have meant, the game being called off, how the players would have felt, the families and friends of those who'd gone to the game, how they would have felt in terms of perhaps not being able to make contact with the people. I think what this, again, these last couple of weeks, and it's a question mark whether some of the incidents are linked, right? There was the discussion yesterday. I mean, Swedish prosecutors haven't ruled it out as a possibility that this is linked in some way. Now, for me, let's be very clear, and I think it's very important to be responsible. The issue that I think we're having right now, at least the frustration that many feel, especially with regards to the conflict in the Middle East, is that there seems to be a very different premium placed on the value of one particular life compared to, let's say, the other. And from my perspective, the way I've been brought up, at least by my parents and my kind of family, friends, and my upbringing and my kind of faith, which comes first and foremost, is that anytime, not just, never mind killing somebody, but even if you even harm in the slightest or assume the rights or take over the rights of another human being, it's not allowed. Simply put, it's simply not put. It's simply put like that in terms of innocent life. So there's no justification whatsoever, especially for that incident yesterday to happen, let's say, under the banner of the faith that you and I share. It doesn't exist, and I won't have anybody convincing me that it does. Now the question is, what was that motivated by? Was that motivated by the incident that happened in Chicago? Again, it makes your heart bleed in terms of when you hear the incident, for those that are not aware, in terms of, and I'm not saying the two incidents were linked, I'm just simply highlighting some of the key incidents around the world that have at least come to notoriety. The event in Chicago where a 71-year-old landlord stabbed a 6-year-old Palestinian boy 26 times. The boy, unfortunately, sadly passed away because of his injuries. The mother was also stabbed repeatedly. She survived. So not only is she in intensive care recovering, but obviously she's going to be mourning the loss of her baby son. And obviously the suspect has been arrested. They've labeled it obviously as a hate crime. Again, it's too early to determine what the motive was and what have you, but there are some links, right, in terms of you have this Middle East conflict and all of a sudden there's an uprising. And I guess that would be the worry for many. And I mean that from a Muslim, non-Muslim perspective, right? I think there's many Muslims that will worry now about how they will be perceived. And similarly, I think a lot of non-Muslims, peace-loving non-Muslims who believe that obviously this is not 99.9% of people are peace-loving people who want to live together and kind of share good times together and all the rest of it and live in peace. Obviously, that's not a privilege that's afforded to the people of Palestine right now, or at least the people of Gaza. So the question, the point I'm just making is that what this has meant for the last couple of weeks for me, especially again, the events of yesterday, the events of Chicago, and especially the events that happened in Gaza, again, the incidents that happened with the incident was it Kafaza with the music festival and what have you. It absolutely cannot be. There's not, again, justification for it. So for me, it's a case of trying to understand what's happening, trying to understand more about the conflict. And I think when it comes to something as serious as this, where perhaps one party's voice, well, not perhaps, but when parties, there's a certain duty upon all of us, irrespective of the side that you fall upon. And this is what I mean about the connection to sports. And I would hope sportsmen would also be the same, which is, and whether or not there's many of them out there who can be as introspective and articulate to articulate their views. And if they don't feel strongly about it, that's fine. They don't need to put their heads above the parapet. But do they feel what I'm saying is it leads to an additional kind of need for more questions, more information, assume more information, be informed, don't be ignorant, at least understand what the discussion points are and what the arguments are. And I'll finish off on this just very quickly because I don't want to ramble on. What I've also seen the last couple of days, and you've seen again, Gareth Southgate made comments with regards to Wembley's or England FA's refusal to light the arch with the blue and white colours of the Israeli flag. Again, I can think why, in terms of this being something that divides or a conflict that divides opinion right now. Prince William also spoke about it as well. You'll have followed Pep Guardiola's daughter posting a message in support of Palestine. What this has really highlighted to me, and I'll just finish on this very quickly, is, and I hope, again, this is not misconstrued, the loss of any innocent life is, for me, a life that's, in a sense, that didn't need to be lost if we put a premium on the fact that the human life is fragile and we cannot simply just resort to this kind of violence where, again, you can take one life because that life doesn't matter as much, but this life, if this life is ended, it's highlighted till the nth degree. And what I think is important to understand is these are not points that are mutually exclusive. You can condemn one attack whilst condemning the other. You can condemn the attack of, let's say, Hamas in terms of what happened, which I do as well, but understand that my credible or my learned approach, or at least it's incumbent and responsible for me, for you and everyone to say, well, hang on, is that where the issue occurred? What's happened as a precursor to that? Let me get a bit more information. So it's not about taking sides. It's simply about being responsible enough as a human being, understanding the seriousness and the severity of this kind of battle and conflict to say, what's happening here? Why is it happening? And to your point, this is not a conflict that is kind of underpinned on religion. It's a conflict ultimately underpinned by the loss of land and the occupation of said land and the increasing of settlements over time. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to conclude is it becomes, I think, incredibly important on all of us and I would encourage anyone, is just to become more informed on the topic. That's all. And to read more and to digest more and to understand the nuance of what one side is doing compared to what the other side is doing. So I think that's what I would say at this point in terms of, and that's a lot I've probably rambled on about, but I hope that made a little bit of sense.
Yeah, you did. I mean, I'm if there's any compassion as a human being, if you have compassion, if you have a heart, if you believe in justice, I don't think it's a complicated discussion at all. I think you can take sides, and I think one should take sides, because ultimately, if you believe in equality, if you believe in justice, if you believe in fairness, it's very simple. I think a lot of people sometimes do equate what's happening in the Middle East as quite complex, quite difficult. There's lots of nuance. I've never subscribed to that philosophy. I think it's quite straightforward, quite simple. Uh, uh, it's complicated and made difficult by by those who have vested interests in creating divisions. It's made complicated by the powers that be, because under normal circumstances, if humanity was was just, there would be no issue. Israel would be vilified. Israel would be
But
absolutely criticized for
yeah,
the action it's taking.
just
Uh,
on that, Ayub, sorry to interrupt, and I will, please don't lose your train of thought because I'm interested. But on that point, because, and this is what I meant about why I believe sportsmen should, in the event that they can encourage positive discussion, because right now what's happening is, to your point, is that there is this kind of one party being allowed to act with impunity and kind of a complete green light, which I think even if you are simply just neutral in this matter, you would know that long term that's the wrong move, in my opinion, because anytime there are no checks and balances, it never works out well. And that's like in parenting or any form of life. If you have the ability to simply act with no checks and balances, with complete freedom, there's a great deal of chance that you'll act in a certain reckless way and what have you. And just to finish off the quick thought, and I'll let you get back to it. And this is why I think sportsmen have a role to play if indeed they are of that mettle where they can encourage good, honest conversation. Because if it's left to those that are in power and in charge, where to your point, they do have certain narratives and agendas and what have you, clearly then the normal status quo will continue, right? And anytime protest and change occurs, it's uncomfortable. It has to be that way. So if it's left to the powers that be, you'll have more of the same. Therefore, you need something, or whether it's through sportsmen or famous people or whoever it is, any party, any person, any stakeholder in this kind of, whether it's in entertainment, arts, whatever it may be, that has influence and has a following, anybody who can kind of yield more honest, good conversation, I think in this particular situation is helpful, because right now, to your point, there's a lot of misinformation out there.
oh, there's a huge amount of misinformation. It's obviously intended for a purpose. It's intended uh, to to move people away from what the truth is, and I think that's my concern. That and it's deliberate, it's intentional. I think anybody who's studied politics, world politics, is aware that we don't live in a world which is fair and just. But what can we do about it? And I think this is really where I I I don't hold my sporting heroes on a pedestal, but I would hope that maybe there's because if there's one thing that sport can do is it does bring people together. Maybe I suppose some people will say in football it splits people apart, the tribalism, but
Well,
ultimately
ask yourself this: the events of Brussels yesterday, does that bring us closer together, or is that going to be ultimately, in the end, react and lead to changes and perhaps policy that will perhaps divide us even more?
I don't know. I mean, incidents like this have happened before. And what I've seen is sometimes knee-jerk reactions, sometimes more divisions. I mean, ultimately, I think for me, when there's an incident like that, especially because it's associated with a certain group within society, so therefore, for me, in my mind, uh, there will be further divisions created. because it's the perpetrator. To me, it's a murderous piece of vermin, scum. Uh, but unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, if rumors are to be believed, it's been classified as a terror act. He's I think that the chap who's from what I've read, again, it's you have
Hmm.
to question what you read, but he's apparently from he's Tunisian. He
Correct.
was denied asylum, so he's illegally in Belgium. I don't know whether he's sort of sworn allegiance to any sort of banned political group and then gone on a rampage. But it again, this is not going to bring people together. It's going to,
Well,
I suppose.
of course. I mean, I don't see any other way that that incident yesterday is going to affect positive change.
Hmm.
And that's the incredibly sad reality of it. I think two human beings, two Swedish fans, unfortunately lost their lives in quite horrendous um, conditions in terms of just the way it fell about. Unfortunately, there's and maybe we shouldn't speak about it, but obviously there's kind of video footage of the rampage, as there often is, unfortunately, of these incredibly sad events, and your heart really does break, because what happens is that if you, and this is where we have to be very careful with our words, there is absolutely no justification whatsoever that happened for yesterday. It's an illegal act. Even in our faith, that's the case. And honestly, it was incredibly sad to see that that is ultimately the recourse. We will, I guess, we'll never know the real true motive because the person that can speak to that is now dead. Um, but in the end, you have to think that in some way, and maybe this is speculatory on my part, but in some way the events of the Middle East are linked. Maybe, perhaps, I don't know. Let's see if we receive more credible information with regards to that. But the sad reality is that how can one individual in their kind of crazed logic and mind come to the conclusion that that was the recourse that they needed to go to kind of gun down innocent civilians who are simply there to watch a game of football and then record afterwards as well, obviously kind of admitting to the crimes and what have you. I mean, the worry is, as often is the case, and I could understand this reaction, which is that, and you've seen some of that rhetoric already, which is, and Brussels is notorious in terms of some of this kind of build up, let's say, of tension and what have you. And Sweden has its own kind of checkered history in terms of, let's just, in terms of influence from immigrants and what have you. My point is, an incident like this, which will be politicized in one way or another, will affect change that you would have to believe will be prohibitive.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because ultimately the masses will call for strong action in response. And I'm not saying that's justified or not. I'm just saying that's always been that sequence of events has stood the test of time.
Hmm.
So when something like that happens at a time when we should be kind of building bridges in terms of the fact that irrespective of race, religion, class, whatever it may be, we are all one in the end in terms of living fairly with one another and not denying the rights of the other, irrespective of which religion you follow. The worry is that events like that set us back some considerable time. And maybe this is what these crazy people unfortunately want, which is kind of anarchy and what have you. But that would be the worry for me, that this is now going to affect, I guess, the majority of which, and I'm talking 99.99% of fair-minded, law-abiding citizens in a very kind of prohibitive and negative way. And that, in some ways, is the sad reality, at least of what happened yesterday. Two innocent people lost their lives in a senseless murder. And I think, and then you have, in a sense, the fallout from that. which will be no doubt where, kind of Sweden's in mourning and what have you, and there afterwards there will be some reaction to that, right? Whether it's with immigrants, how was it that he was refused entry and yet still was in amongst the streets? Why was he not kind of, sent back to Tunisia or wherever it may be? So that would be the worry, that events like that, especially in the sphere of the sporting kind of spectacle.
Inevitably, there's always the need for retribution, and in a sense, maybe that that fits in with what happens in the Middle East. For every action, there's a reaction, and no doubt there will be a reaction, both politically and maybe within communities, because there may be some people who feel very angry with what's happened, and they will want vengeance, and they will view maybe Muslims uh, as legitimate targets, irrespective of who they are. And the cycle keeps on continuing. Um, I mean, I'm, as I said, I'm a political animal, and I'm aware that politics and politicians and uh, uh, very rich individuals, there is a lot that happens in society which a lot of us probably aren't aware of unless you dig deep. And when you dig deep, it's quite murky. The world is very murky in terms of those at the very top. Sometimes chaos is very profitable. War is very profitable. Uh, 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 Conflicts between communities is very profitable. So that there is profit to be had in what's happening at this moment in time. Uh, I mean, it's something that is always when surveys are done in terms of companies that are very uh, uh, who have huge turnovers and very profitable. Usually, Lockheed Martin, one of the arms manufacturers, is always up there. A lot of these politicians are in bed with some of these pharmaceuticals. I mean, Russell Brand, for example, a slight different tangent, but he was recently, the media went after him. He does a podcast, and if anybody does watch his podcast, they'll probably understand why that the media felt compelled, or those in power felt compelled to go after Russell Brand. And also, I mean, just as I said, I talked about being a socialist, or at least having socialist inclinations. I was a tremendous admirer of Jeremy Corbyn. He at one stage looked potentially to be on in line to win the 2017 election, but then he narrowly missed. But then there was a huge campaign who portrayed him and the party that he was leading as anti-Semitic. Uh, it was manufactured. I mean, if you read the mainstream media, it will give you a skewed, and it will give you a narrative which is what they want you to believe. But if you take the time and the effort to scroll and read independent journalists, independent reporters, and those who perhaps have journalism at their core, at the heart, which is about honesty, integrity, they will paint a slightly different picture that Jeremy Corbyn never has been an anti-Semite. If anything, he's perhaps one of the most fair, just individuals. In fact, he's perhaps not the type of politician that will succeed purely because he has integrity, he has compassion, he has humanity, everything that really modern politicians should not have to succeed. I'm just at the moment in a very difficult position, because what I struggle with is a solution. I don't think there is a solution. Unfortunately, those that govern us, those that lead many nations that are powerful, have a desire to divide. It's to serve the interests of perhaps the wealthy and the powerful. So this is where perhaps I look at sportsmen to have maybe some integrity, especially those who are successful, to perhaps stand on the right side of history. But will we get that?
I mean, yeah, it's difficult to see, right? Because ultimately, sportsmen, to your point, and you mentioned this earlier, you that we don't ask them to be. I mean, unfortunately, as is often the case with these machines, especially sports stars who can swing the pendulum. as we may call it, they are propped up by sponsors, and they have major kind of off the field or off the court income, and often these sponsors are also kind of tied in with other, let's say, influential lobbies and parties and what have you, and stakeholders, and ultimately they have to be mindful about what they put out, right? You only need to see what some of these sportsmen and entertainment artists get for posts on Instagram to know how far their voice reaches, and how valuable in monetary terms their voice is in terms of posts and what have you. The question is, are they allowed to be, let's say, free and critical thinkers when it comes to this kind of subject? I am skeptical. In my opinion, I think what you need, ultimately, what you find out about people is if you're willing to sacrifice something. Are you willing to sacrifice
Yeah.
your career the same way, let's say, Colin Kaepernick was? Whether you agreed with him or disagreed with him, he had a lot to lose by taking the stand that he did, and he did. He lost his career at the end of it. Now, some may argue his form was dwindling and all the rest of it, but even still, he did not. He was then he struggled obviously there afterwards to forge any type of career in the National Football League. The point is, I think the only thing I want to say about with regards to this particular conflict, and you touched on it many times, Ayub, I think you said that to your mind, there's no real, let's say, it's not really that difficult with regards to this conflict. I think you underestimate, in a sense, I don't think you underestimate it, but the power, let's say, of the narrative and the kind of media, at least the mainstream media. And it sounds very conspiratorial when you speak in these terms. And I am absolutely not like this, but this is what I meant about how this war, these few incidents have touched me in a way where I was like, okay, I need to be more informed on this topic. So let me just read more. And that's how I do it. I like to read more. I like to listen more. I like to listen to podcasts, critical debaters who are esteemed in their subject area. And that's all I would ask anybody to do with anything, really. Something serious and something less serious, which is, if you're going to garner and share an opinion, become as educated as you can be with regards to that particular area before you share, because the narrative right now is so powerful and the media machine is so incredible that if you weren't of that, which 80-85% of society isn't, they'll read the tabloids, they'll read the headlines, they'll read some of the savagery and butchery that has been described in great detail when it comes to the act. But then the question has to be, and again, I'm very comfortable in condemning that act. You cannot justify the killing of any innocent life whatsoever. The question then for me is, okay, well, how did this happen? Why? What's been happening? And I think that's the very interesting, unique thing about this particular conflict, which has been going on for many years, which is that as much as you may try to break the spirit of a particular people here by, bombing kind of 6,000 times in 6 days and what have you, with complete freedom and a green light from all the European governments and what have you in the Western world, which, again, fine, if that's your prerogative, that's your it's to your point, it's unjust and what have you. But what it does, and what is difficult for them for a lot to comprehend, is that it doesn't break the spirit of the cause itself and the voice of the cause. And if anything, it's highlighted the unjust nature of perhaps what's occurring. And the only reason I say that is because of all that has transpired prior to the events of the music festival. Was the music festival events barbaric and savage? 100%. If all that we read is correct, it was. And that's what I mean. It's not mutually exclusive to that point to then say, and then when you read about the fact that that happens pretty much on a regular occurrence to the people of Gaza in that kind of open air prison, that's all I ask, where if you read and if you inform yourself, and I think that's what is happening as a natural consequence of this conflict being highlighted again in the media. And I think that is the challenge for those who are trying to kind of oppress perhaps the Palestinian cause, the fact that this spirit ultimately, whether it's in the Western world through protests or whether it's through neighboring countries or whatever it may be, the Palestinian people may not have much, but ultimately they are still in the hearts of many. And that is a very difficult, you may ethnically cleanse a whole group of people or what have you, or remove them from the face of the earth. And that they can have the capability to do because they have the weapons to do so, and they have the political kind of platform to do because the green light exists. But in the end, you use that wonderful phrase in terms of being on the right side of history. And I'm pretty sure in times when perhaps you and I are not here, we will look back on this time and understand in very clear terms that all that transpired, and I come back to it, all that transpired prior to the events of that horrible event at that music festival, they will realize that ultimately there was one party that was being oppressed, and it's not necessarily the party that's being portrayed as such in the media currently.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, it's. I mean, you've talked about it. I mean, we'll sort of wrap up quite shortly, but you've talked about being informed, and I think if there's anything that I would really hope that people do is really take the time and the trouble to inform themselves. And I think the key is really it's which position, because I've heard, I mean, I've tried to, and it's painful to listen to the opposing side. The reason why is, I mean, I have no objections to there being two sides. I mean, in terms of politics, Conservative, Labour, obviously there's sort of liberals, Greens, but I have no issue when it comes to conversations such as that. But on this matter, the conflict in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine. To me, there is, as I said, it's straightforward. I have absolutely no problem, and I would go on record every single time. To me, there's an aggressor and there's a victim, and how on earth anybody. I mean, I do know how, because there is an agenda. If anybody considers Israel to be a victim, there is an agenda. I mean, it's absolutely nonsense, because, and I would encourage people to read the Balfour Declaration. I would encourage people to read or study Theodore Herzl, the founding father of Zionism, what he stood for. I would encourage people to read Sykes-Picot, at least understand what Sykes-Picot, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was, because at the turn of the century in Israel, there was in Palestine, there was 3-4% Jewish people. The rest were Palestinian, which were made up of Christians and Muslims. That the British hand has been instrumental in the Middle East, not just in Palestine, but in the Middle East. It has there's a lot of sin to go around, and a lot of it is in the direction of Britain and what Britain has done. But I certainly would encourage people to try and read as much as they possibly can do. But again, it's I think with the amount of misinformation and fake news, it's difficult to try and ascertain as to who you listen to. But people have got to make the effort, because but in this case, to me, it's just I have nothing but empathy, sympathy, and to me, throughout my lifetime, if there's been one issue which has been dominant and prevalent throughout my lifetime, which has been quite pivotal to what I believe in, it's the plight of the Palestinians. Because in a sense, I think that throughout my lifetime, that's always been the issue. And in a sense, as long as there is injustice in Palestine, there will be injustice in the world, because that, to me, absolutely embodies the way that the world is at this moment in time. The rich and the powerful are, in my opinion, oppressors. They enforce upon the world a skewed history, a skewed narrative. And I think anybody who has any heart, any compassion, you have to be on the side of the Palestinians. Simple as that. As I said, it's not a religious. I've never ever just fallen on this. Oh, they're Muslims, and I am a Muslim, so therefore I must unequivocally back their cause. No, it really is always about justice. For me, I have no problem if there was a Muslim aggressor. I would be against those aggressors. I would be against those Muslims. If they were aggressing against Christians, I'd be on the side of the Christians. And this is what this is. And really, I mean, I suppose we've tried to interweave sport into this. And for my final point would be the if when they're doing surveys of the greatest figures, greatest sportsmen, there is one name that always invariably is at the top of the list. And he's a hero of mine, Muhammad Ali. I never really watched him box. I mean, I just wasn't really around to watch him box, but certainly in terms of
Were you
what his
not?
legacy is. No, because by the time I think when I remember in the 80s, he was gone. I do vaguely recall. I think I don't know when it was in the 80, 81, 82. I think he fought Larry Holmes, but he was a punchbag by then. So really, it was not the Ali of the Rumble in the Jungle, all that kind of stuff. So I never really sort of watched, and I'm not a massive boxing fan anyway. But what he stood for and what he gave up. I mean, you talked about it. He gave up his peak years, and you talked about sacrifice. If any sportsman really is worth their salt, what they should always do is look at Muhammad Ali. Now he was I would encourage our viewers to watch a little video, Jesse Ventura. I don't know whether you
Yeah,
our viewers have heard of Jesse Ventura, but he's a politician, an actor. I think he was a wrestler as well.
a
But
wrestler
he
first.
oh, wrestler first, all right. But he was a he did he did an interview, and it's in segments with I think a chap called Graham McPherson. I mean I think I've got the name wrong, but if you go onto YouTube, he talks about his experience of Muhammad Ali. He was a great fan of Muhammad Ali, and he got quite emotional. It's only about 5 6 minutes this video, but Jesse Ventura. I mean, anybody who knows Jesse Ventura, he's a big, powerful character, a
Mhm.
big, powerful man. Uh, but he got really emotional thinking about Muhammad Ali, and he said, if I could be half the man Muhammad Ali was, and that was based not on his boxing, but on his character, that he was prepared to give up the heavyweight crown is one of perhaps the greatest sporting achievements, accomplishments. He was prepared to give that up. He went to prison, knowing full well. I mean, he resisted joining the army because, as you rightly pointed out, he did not want to fight in an unjust war and fight people that he had no beef with. But he was prepared to go to prison, give up the heavyweight crown, and that to me should always be any sportsman really should always look at Muhammad Ali and say, right, that to me is I'm somebody that perhaps, especially if you're a good sportsman, that you're somebody that is going to be revered, respected, and people will look up to you. And maybe it becomes incumbent upon you that in times where it is perhaps important uh, to to make a point to be on the right side of history. And this to me is that occasion.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's feasible and possible, let's say in this day and age, to the point in terms of the fact there's millions and millions on offer, millions at stake, businesses at stake, influence at stake, whether or not you're going to get that type of or that level of sacrifice. I'm interested to see it. Quite often it's either the waning powers or of a star that once was, let's say, or what have you. Again, I judge it, and I'm not asking sportsmen to be this way, but I judge it in terms of what are you ultimately sacrificing, right? That gives sometimes more credence to your view, because often whenever somebody shares a certain strong view, and whether that's a dissenting voice of some kind, the initial reaction by many is ultimately, oh, what's this person trying to gain here, and what have you, or they're out their way of the sport anyway. If you think, hang on, this person's actually sacrificing a lot here in terms of finance, money, fame, kind of influence, then that's a very different measure. Again, the Jordan Henderson thing for me was neither here nor there. He was propped up by a certain community with regards to pushing and advocating the rights and of a certain community and what have you. But ultimately, it's a transactional. It helps his image, it helps his brand. And now that he's gone to a country that doesn't necessarily adhere to those same kind of liberties and rights, shall we say, because ultimately there is money and serious money on offer for him, I'm okay with it. I was okay with the first pick because I understood it for what it was. was not necessarily somebody who was holier than thou or what have you. He was simply making a decision that was good for his brand and image, and equally now he's doing the best for his family. I don't have an issue either way. I saw it for what it was, transactional. So I think in the end, the only thing I will finish, and I want to ask you that quick question about the tennis, which I won't come on to because it's been a long conversation. But just before I do, I think the bit about today was just about a conversation. To your point, we've tried to not tried. I think we've tried to be sensitive to the events that have happened yesterday. Because if you by text you immediately after the incident yesterday, last night, saying I'd like to discuss this because it was something that was incredibly shocking to me, and how that is then obviously linked. It's difficult to avoid then the elephant in the room with regards to the conflict in the Middle East. I think if there's been anything, I guess, misinterpreted or what have you, or misconstrued, it's obviously not the intent of you and I. Ultimately, the aim in the end is always to have good, constructive, honest conversation, not necessarily to force one narrative on the other, but the encouragement that, at least, and I'm sure I speak for you, Ayub, is to try and understand more what's happening around here. I mean, this idea that one party has the right to defend itself. Well, the story didn't actually start at the event of that music festival, the hideous events at that music festival. And that's the point. Yes, if you believe in the fact that, again, a country has a right to defend itself, fine, no issues. But you're acting as if that was the initial act of aggression, when actually there were many years of daily consistent abuse and oppression and kind of subjugation of a certain kind of civilization and community. So I would ask anyone to kind of take some time out and listen, whatever media it is, listen, be informed, various different publications, podcasts, information out there. If you have the wherewithal, the interest, and I guess in the end, the conscience to become more informed, because I think that's the bare minimum that we can afford, let's say, with regards to this type of sad events, let's say, where ultimately innocent people are losing their lives. Just to finish off on a question that I had from early part of the podcast, that you remember famously Wimbledon banning the Russian and Belarusian athletes from participating. I think it was in the year 2022 Wimbledon.
Yeah.
With regards as a reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine, obviously Belarus being a strong proponent and support for Russia. What were your thoughts on that with Wimbledon banning those athletes? If you remember, the year after, I think they allowed the athletes to participate under a neutral flag, or a neutral kind of alliance, let's say, in terms of their national allegiance. What were your thoughts on Wimbledon's decision to ban the Russian athletes? And you saw that also kind of permeate in other sports as well.
It goes back to the point I was trying to make, that it states getting involved, I've never been a keen advocate of. I think those individuals, whilst they're representing their countries, it's an individual sport, tennis. I mean, they just so happen to be Belarusian. I mean, now if they'd come out and act and publicly sort of stated their support for Russia, even then, those athletes, what was the offense they had committed? I'd like to know, what was the offense they'd committed? Had they invaded Ukraine? From my knowledge, they'd not invaded Ukraine, even if they'd expressed support. To me,
I remember. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I objected to that. I mean, I objected to because again, it's this state interference. Now, I mean, we talked about sports and politics being inextricably linked, but I never agreed with that. I never agreed with that at all. As I said, these were individuals who just happened to be associated with a nation that perhaps they didn't get on with at that time, or they had an issue with. So I didn't have a problem with that, or I had an issue with that. They should have been allowed to participate.
Yeah, no, just interesting to gather your thoughts. I mean, we'll wrap up. In the end, I found it surprising, because I think to myself, from a fairness and equality, I understand the idea. I mean, in the end, it was still virtue signaling, no matter how you slice it and dice it. The idea that kind of trying to reduce in some way Russia's kind of influence, let's say, right, on the global scale. And Wimbledon is the premier tennis event with regards to the 4 major slams in tennis. But I always think to myself, I understand that, and I get it that Russian players form part of, they have to be part of the Russian Federation, in terms of registration and what have you, and thereafterwards, they are ranked in the ATP rankings, and thereafter, obviously participating. Daniil Medvedev, I think, was #2 in the world, I think, at the time when he was not allowed. But I sometimes think to myself, from a fairness and equality perspective, although I agree it must have been a tough decision, is that person couldn't be helped but be born in Russia.
Mm.
And that's fine. We all don't have influence over where we're born. Certainly the Palestinian people don't. The question is, if you don't have a control over where you're born and you are Russian by birth and by heritage and what have you, why do we disallow? I mean, I can't understand how that can't be discrimination. It's the very essence of
Yeah,
discrimination, is it not? Which is that you were
yeah.
born in Russia, a country that currently we don't like,
Mm.
and therefore you will not participate. I mean, the player did not ask to be born in that country. They may love their country, they may not. They may be apathetic towards it. But why? I mean, it made very little sense. I think, if anything, it went, at least in my, again, for somebody who's trying to be free and critical thinking themselves, is thinking, understand it's a tough call, because you might want to, and again, sport and politics is always mixed in some ways. So there's always been penalties or what have you, and all the rest of it. And I get it. Some may argue Martin Samuel was a critic at the time, or not a critic, but was a strong advocate of Russian athletes being banned at the time. And I always found myself just kind of thinking that through and thinking, well, I get that, but ultimately, surely it's counterproductive and also kind of slightly hypocritical, because what we're arguing is that this is a competition that's free and you can make it, and if you're good enough, you play, and all the rest of it. It's not as if those athletes themselves had transgressed, right? So
Mm.
it's one thing if that particular athlete has said something or done something, but if you're banning them simply because of where they came from, I don't see how that's anything but discrimination. So I could not understand that one. But anyway, I
I
just wanted
agree, absolutely agree. I mean, I just to add a final point on that. I mean, as I said, these were individuals. Now, I think even if they've expressed views in support of the Russian invasion, I still don't have an issue. I mean, the West professes to be a bastion of democracy and freedom of speech. That's unfortunately one of the pitfalls of freedom of speech. If you allow freedom of speech, you've got to then be prepared to accept views that may be polar opposite to yours. So I had, and they were individuals, as I said. It wasn't they weren't a national team or representing the
to.
nation. So it weren't a Davis Cup where it's obviously nation pitted
Yeah.
against nation. And even then, I still wouldn't have sort of had an issue. So I just think there's lots of hypocrisy. Uh, uh, but the ultimate, really, for me, takeaway from this should be that we just need to, as individuals, just be absolutely more geared towards being well versed in what's happening in the world, and be critical, and in any way perhaps be involved in politics. And I use politics in inverted commas, to be involved in in trying to make a change for the better. I mean, there's obviously protests going on, marches going on, absolutely for that. Because that's just the start, that's just the beginning. But on that note, I mean, it's been a heavy discussion. We've talked about various things, some from history, some from present. I mean, it's obviously quite depressing, I suppose, some of the things that we've talked about, but it is the modern world that we live in. It's the world that we we need to sort of see if we can influence, we can change. But it's been an interesting conversation. It's been a heavy conversation. It's been a tough conversation, because obviously we're talking about incidents which have cost numerous lives. It's causing lots of pain and misery to people across many parts of the world. So it's painful, but I think it was important that at least we offered our views and thoughts on it. So on that note, we'll wrap up. We'll be interested to find out what your views on this subject are, uh, because it's an emotive subject. It's obviously one where people do get very passionate about. Hopefully, if you are making a comment, you can be reasoned in your comment. But that's it for today's show. We will be back on Friday. I think we're recording on Friday, and the Football League is, I mean, the Premier League is back. So hopefully we can not forget about what's happening in the world, but at least for a moment, maybe just sort of focus on football, so we can just have a little bit of respite from all the madness that's happening. So thank you as always for tuning in, and until the next time, please stay safe.